Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Brook Farm Institute for Critical Studies. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Uh, Brook Farm Institute is an experiment in building something familiar, and yet these days, I think, maybe not so familiar after all, a space for free intellectual inquiry beyond the increasingly intolerable constraints of the neoliberal university. At BFI, we're committed to academic freedom and what we call the prefigurative humanities, which is an approach that is, in one sense, deeply traditional. It involves practices that serious intellectual life has long embraced, close reading and challenging conversations with real human beings. On the other hand, in the age of AI, such old school methods, we believe, can constitute a form of resistance to intellectual homogeneity. So at Brook Farm Institute, we draw consciously on the political tradition of prefigurative politics, especially associated with the anarchists and utopian socialist experiments, like our namesake, the original Brook Farm community, established south of Boston in 1841, where thinkers and activists sought to reimagine new forms of work and play that might anticipate a different path into the future. If you've not added yourself to our mailing list, I encourage you to do so. We offer in-person graduate level seminars in Cambridge, Massachusetts on a wide range of topics in the humanities and social sciences, as well as many more online seminars, all open to the general public. You can find our course listings from now through the summer at brookfarminstitute.com. Our new speaker series, Critical Interventions, for which this is the inaugural event, will feature discussions with prominent scholars and intellectuals on urgent moral and political questions of our time. Our next scheduled event will be an in-person talk here in Cambridge on June 1st with the political theorist Alex Gurevich on challenges to academic freedom today. Again, that is June 1st at the Cambridge Public Library. Turning to tonight's topic. Even as I speak, Trump's war of choice in Iran continues to take its toll across the region. The current crisis began with the horrifying destruction of a girls' school in Minab, where 175 people, mostly school children, were killed as American Tomahawk missiles struck. Since then, thousands more have been killed, civilians and soldiers alike, across Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine. As in Gaza, international humanitarian law has been routinely and flagrantly cast aside. Schools, homes, hospitals, and ordinary neighborhoods have become battlefields. The scale of human suffering is appalling. We're fortunate to open this series with one of the most important historians of modern Iran, Ervand Abrahamian. Professor Abrahamian is a retired distinguished professor of history at my alma mater, the CUNY Graduate Center. I am speaking while I'm admitting people to the meeting at the same time. Is a retired distinguished professor of history at my alma mater, the CUNY Graduate Center, and for decades he's been one of the most influential scholars of Iranian political and social history. His work has shaped how generations of readers understand the 1953 coup, the 1979 revolution, and the long, troubled history of U.S.-Iran relations. His landmark books, including Iran Between Two Revolutions, Khomeiniism, and the History of Modern Iran, are indispensable companions for anyone who wishes to understand Iran's history, and he has just completed a new book on the 1979 revolution. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ervand Abrahamian.
Thank you, Christoph, for inviting me. We have the natural tendency to think that if a regime has a despicable internal politics, it also has a despicable external policies. Historically, that's not true. And in the present case of Iran, it's also not true. Iran, no doubt, internally has been really despicable. Only recently in January, there were mass killings in the streets, almost throughout the whole country of the opposition. Clearly, the regime had reduced itself to basically 15 to 20% of the population. This is a regime that has started with probably about 90% popular support, right? And this was in genuine free referendums. But over the years, the regime has systematically salami tactics at its own base alienating this group, that group, to the point that it had shrunk basically its base to 15 to 20%. And the only way it could function was through the use of violence and massive violence in the streets. So from that premise, people presume that the regime also has a despicable foreign policy. However, I would argue that if you look at Iran's foreign policy since the revolution, it's been actually quite reasonable, quite pragmatic, quite rational. Despite the image abroad that it's run by fanatics who are eagerly waiting for the end of time, the return of the Messiah, and basically hoping for martyrdom, what you actually see is the regime is on a practical level in its dealings with the outside world has been quite pragmatic, quite flexible, and actually quite, I would say, reasonable. The problems have been often outside, especially in Tel Aviv and Washington, rather than in Tehran. So if you initially, in 79, the revolution started off with the idea that this was they had a message for the world, and this was a universal, basically, revolution like 1917. They soon discovered, in fact, that this revolution did not resonate much, even in the Muslim world. It was a revolution very much in the language of Shiism, and it appealed only actually among Shia communities, often besieged Shia communities outside Iran, who as protection looked towards Iran as help. So often what was seen abroad as if Iran was trying to rebuild an Achaemenian empire all the way from Mediterranean to India. In fact, what the regime was reduced to was to try to get a foothold in areas where there were Shias who were besieged by a hostile, larger community and looked for Iran for protection. And these groups became later known as, of course, proxies. They were not really proxies. They were basically allies seeking Iran as protection. But if you look at the Iranian foreign policy after 1980-81, you find basically it was quite realistic. It wasn't, I wouldn't say, even revisionist or trying to overthrow regimes or restructure the Middle East. It was basically interested in self-preservation and protection of itself. You often find commentators on television here talking about, in one hand, Iran is basically led by mad mullahs who want to upturn everything and await the return of the Messiah. At the same time, in the same breath, they say all they want is actually self-preservation. They're selfish and eager to survive. I would argue that basically the second argument is much more realistic. The regime has on the whole been quite flexible and often been willing to actually come to some agreement, especially with the United States. To give you some examples, when the United States decided to invade Afghanistan, Iran actually helped United States in invading Afghanistan. Iran had its own problems with the Taliban, and even though they both considered themselves Islamic states, Iran took the pragmatic position that the Taliban was a threat to Iran and was willing to help United States in occupying Afghanistan. Similarly, with Iraq, when the United States decided to invade Iraq, again, Iran actually helped United States. And when there was an ISIS revolt, a fundamentalist Shia revolt in Iraq against the United States, Iran actually participated with the United States in crushing ISIS. If you look at the pictures of Mosul, that was basically flattened, it was flattened by American bombers, but the ground troops, the soldiers who actually went from house to house, were predominantly Iraqi militia trained and armed by Iran. So it was a joint effort by United States and Iran to actually crush ISIS. And of course, another sign of attempted rapprochement with the United States was the Iranian president offered actually American oil companies lucrative deals if the U.S. came in. It was the U.S. that actually refused to do so and slapped Iran with the label of being part of the axis of evil. So despite all the help Iran had given to the United States, it was still labeled the axis of evil. And of course, the final example of Iran attempt to deal with the United States in a reasonable basis was the Obama nuclear agreement. The agreement, in a way, was satisfactory both for the United States and for Iran. Iran got the right to enrich uranium as long as it could actually verify that it was not doing it in order to produce nuclear weapons. And Obama got for US what US wanted, which was that Iran would have limited enrichment, but not to the point of actually enriching for nuclear weaponry. The agreement was dismissed unfairly in the United States and Israel as being too dangerous because it was too vague. In fact, there was nothing vague about it, a 150-page document with very precise limitations on Iran. Iran could limit its enrichment to 3.67%. You couldn't be more precise than 3.67% enrichment, limited to 200 grams of it. And also, the more advanced centrifuges were disbanded, and it was done under UN verification. UN nuclear observers, 140 of them, including American observers, monitored the whole system. So if one's concern was Iran developing a nuclear weapon, there was no way Iran could do it under this agreement. And in fact, in Israel, the Mossad officials who knew anything about nuclear technology actually thought it was a good agreement. Yet Netanyahu, for his reasons, I'll get to later on, denounced this as a threat to Israel, an existentialist threat. And Netanyahu rushed from Israel to Washington to denounce it. And of course, he worked together with the Republicans to oppose it, to make sure it was not an agreement, basically, that was certified by Congress. So, and of course, Netanyahu also persuaded Trump, once he became president, to basically wash it down the toilet as the worst treaty agreement the United States had ever in its history signed. So you have many examples where you can say Iran actually, because of its fairly, I think, a realistic foreign policy, reached out to have an agreement with the United States. Now, of course, there was the polemics but the polemics of debt to the United States, debt to Israel, was something really for the street. It was more for rhetoric and the idea that somehow the revolution was alive. but it was not something that actually, when a diplomat sat and talked and discussed, something that was basically seen as part of the Iranian policy to destroy America and destroy Israel. Of course, it would have been quite imaginary for Iran, a small country with a tiny, compared to United States GNP, of being able to overthrow or destroy United States or Israel with all its nuclear weaponry. So if you put aside the rhetoric, and of course, one you have to remember that America and Israel also had its extremist rhetoric. There were plenty of American politicians whose main argument was the only way to deal with Iran is to bomb, 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 and basically to have regime change or destroy Iran as the only way of getting rid of the existential threat. So I think when the politicians on both sides, Obama's side and also the Iranian side, sat down to negotiate, they were more realistic. They were not led aside by the rhetoric of death to this country or death to the other country. Instead, even when Iran used the rhetoric, death to Israel, there are actually a number of cases, times when Iranian presidents openly said that they were willing to accept a two-state solution if the Palestinians accepted a two-state solution. And even now, the official position of the Iranian state is they accept the proposals that the Saudis have given. And of course, the Saudi proposal accepts a two-state solution. So Iran, in many ways, is more actually forthcoming on the Israeli issue. It accepts a two-state solution, and the United States seems to have actually retreated that from position and no longer talks about a two-state solution. So on the whole, I would say, however much one disagrees with Iranian internal policy, its foreign policy has been fairly, I would say, moderate, down to earth, and realistic. And the problems has always been actually from outside. If you look at the US position right from 1980 onwards, with the exception of the Obama period, the position has always been Iran should have no nuclear technology, no nuclear research, no nuclear scientists. Why? Because this could lead eventually to a nuclear bomb. And it was Obama that actually shifted position from no nuclear research to actually limited nuclear project in Iran as long as it was monitored and verifiably ensured that it could not develop a bomb. And it was that brief Obama period that actually led to the agreement. It wasn't so much the extreme sanctions that forced Iran to the table. It was actually Obama's more, I would say, realistic position of backing down from the extremist position to accepting Iran having the right for nuclear research that led to the possibility of the agreement. The question you can ask is, why is Iran so interested in nuclear research? Here, although I would not agree with the policy, I think there are better ways of getting energy than having nuclear technology. I think solar, wind, is much more important, much more actually realistic than nuclear. But for the Iranian regime, nuclear technology has become a mark of becoming a modern, technologically advanced state. It's a way of proof that you are a sovereign, independent state. it takes the position, it has replaced the demand for oil nationalization under the Mossadegh period. Again, the Mossadegh period of calling for nationalization of oil, it wasn't about money, dollars or cents. It was a way of proving that Iran was a sovereign, independent state, no longer a semi-colonial a victim of British imperialism. If Iran controlled its own oil resources, then it would be a sign that it was an independent sovereign state. Similarly, for the present leaders in Iran, the idea of nuclear technology, research, science is a mark of basically being a modern, a technologically cutting state. You may not agree with this or not, but it's not really a desire to have a bomb so much as to have basically the honor or the reputation of being an advanced state. So the question then becomes why the U.S. actually withdrew from the agreement. If the U.S. had not withdrawn from the agreement, we would not be in the present state we're in at a war. And Trump obviously withdrew from the agreement because he wanted to listen to Netanyahu on this issue. Now, here you have to look at back what U.S. foreign policy is towards Iran. U.S. has basically, since 1979-80, outsourced its Iran policy to Israel. Iran does not have an embassy there. It does not have a committee or a workshop group on Iran in the State Department. There's no one that I know in the National Security Council who knows anything about Iran or Iranian nuclear policy. Basically, the idea has been, with the exception of the Obama period, if we want to know anything about Iran, we'll ask the Israelis. They know. We'll outsource, basically, our foreign policy to our good friends, allies, Israel. And there's a tradition to this too. If you go back before the revolution, Iran, State Department and U.S. again did not have a real policy towards Iran. It didn't know what was happening inside Iran. Again, the idea of the presidents in Washington was that if we want to know anything about Iran, we'll ask the Shah. They outsourced their policy to the Shah. So it was easy after the revolution to outsource U.S. policy towards Israel. And however closely you look at the people in Washington who have any role in U.S. policy towards Iran, you find they really don't know anything about Iran. So who does, for instance, Trump send to negotiate to Geneva and to Pakistan? It's basically American politicians, relatives, former real estate dealers who have no expertise in diplomacy, not to mention Iranian foreign policy. Even under the Biden administration, there was only one person there who actually knew anything about Iran, had negotiated during the Obama period, and he was quickly basically sidelined and his security clearance was taken away. So he couldn't really speak or have a role in discussions with Iran, with dealing with Iran. So the US was really left with the advice of Netanyahu on what to do for U.S. foreign policy about Iran. And Netanyahu's policy has always been that that Iran is an existential threat, that any nuclear research in Iran was a vital threat, direct threat to the United States, because Iran is determined. Of course, there's no evidence of that, but he claimed Iran was determined to have a nuclear weapon, and the nuclear weapon would be then directed at Israel. So this became a mantra for the Zionist state under Netanyahu. So much so that, of course, it resonates effectively in a community that has basically survived the Holocaust, because all you have to do is bring out the image and memory of the Holocaust and say, well, the mad mullahs are like the Nazis, they're out to get you, to rally the population in Israel behind Netanyahu. So even though I don't think Mossad knows that there was no real Iranian program to have a nuclear weapon, Netanyahu used this as an issue, political issue, and it was, of course, a clever and successful way of rallying people around him as defend the flag Israel against the existential threat. To understand this again, you have to look at the Israeli foreign policy really from its inception. The Israeli problem has been from the beginning the Palestinian issue. Here you have a large minority within the borders of Israel that are Palestinian, not Jewish or full citizens. And this has been a sore issue, you could say, right from 1948. At first, the Israeli position was that there are no such things as Palestinians, and therefore there is no Palestinian issue. If you look at early Golda Meir's line, she was clearly said the Palestinians just don't exist, so there is no Palestinian problem. Once the international community basically came to a consensus that there was a Palestinian population, there was a Palestinian nation, then the Israeli line became, yes, there are Palestinians, but the Palestinian problem is caused by outside pressures, outside influences. First, it was Abdel Nasser and Egypt. They were the problem. If Abdel Nasser was removed, then the Palestinian problem would be resolved. Well, Abdel Nasser disappeared. Then it was the Soviet Union was the problem. Then the Soviet Union disappeared. After the Soviet Union, it was Saddam Hussein, it was Gaddafi, it was Assad. They all disappeared. So now Iran has become the bogeyman outside, the argument being that if somehow by miracle, whatever, Israel managed to eliminate Iran, then the Palestinian problem would no longer be a problem and it would be resolved. So in a way, there's this link between the Iranian issue and the Palestinian issue, but it's not the direct way, the way that Netanyahu pictures it, that Iran is supporting Hamas or the PLO or is financing the Palestinians. It's much more that Iran is portrayed as being the real problem, the obstacle in resolving the Palestinian difficulty. So here now, what is Israel's real policy? Now, the official line was that the recent war was if we have 3 or 4 days of bombing, and this they persuaded Trump, since again, Trump knows nothing about Iran. He doesn't listen to people. People around him know nothing about Iran. He was easily persuaded, and this actually New York Times basically documents that that if there was a 3 day or 4 days bombing the problem of Iran would be resolved. Either that the regime would collapse, or the regime, like in Argentine, would become basically docile. Or I think the Israeli position was even more actually maximalist. The Israelis, I think, are smart enough, especially Mossad, know that there's not going to be a regime change. The idea of the Shah returning, they're quite aware that that's not possible. And they also, I think, savvy enough to know if you actually start the war, you're going to harden the more hardliners in the regime, which is exactly what happened. So the question is, what was their thinking? And I think what they're thinking was very maximalist. They are out not to get regime change or destruction of regime. Their policy is being actually for quite a time to actually destroy Iran as a state, as a nation. And if you look at some Israeli writings in the last 20 years, there's the notion, and even their maps they put in Iran, is that Iran is really formed of many different ethnic groups, linguistic groups, that this is not basically a viable state. This is not a true state. It can easily be broken apart, as was happened with, of course, with Syria, with Libya, with Iraq, with Yemen. You could basically decapitate the top levels, and the whole state, the whole nation would fall apart. And so, an illustration of this thinking, I can give you a lot of examples where the Israelis sort of toy with the idea that Iran should no longer exist as a nation. Is that the last speech that Trump made before this war, recent war? He said he encouraged the various ethnic groups in Iran to rise up against a Persian dominant group. And he gave a list of the obvious ethnic groups, Baluchis, Kurds, Arabs, and so on. And then at the end of the list, he gave a group called Akhvakis. So I looked up, I'd never heard of such a group in Iran. So I do what we all do, is I Googled to see who these people were. It turned out they're a Sunni community that lives on the other side of the Caucasus in Dagestan. So the question becomes, why did such a group appear in Trump's speech as part of a subjected, oppressed minority in Iran, unless someone in Israel had the idea of actually recruiting mercenaries if in a future civil war in Iran, and bringing them into Iran as basically so-called volunteers. And this sounds far-fetched, but that's what was actually done in Syria. You had various groups from Central Asia suddenly appearing as freedom fighters against Assad. So if the long-term project was actually destruction of Iran, then that would fit into the idea that somehow you could actually inject other groups into Iran as part of the dismantling of the regime. Of course, where they made the mistake is thinking that the regime was so fragile that by decapitation, the whole society could unravel. And that's obviously did not happen. The state, however brutal and unpopular it has survived. Its war has probably strengthened the state. And the result is basically now a stalemate between, of course, Iran and the United States and Israel, which is somewhat ironic since Iran's GNP is tiny compared to that of the United States. Yet here, a small country, a third world country, has basically been able to stand up to United States, surprisingly because of its basically its leverage in the Gulf area. And if we have time, I'll talk about actually this leverage is far more extensive and far more dangerous to United States than the media realizes. But if the war continues, Iran has actually, it could obviously suffer a lot of damage through bombing, but it is in a position to actually inflict far more damage to the world economy, especially Wall Street and the US economy in forthcoming years if the war continues. I'll probably gone over my time, so I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ervand. I want to just let everyone know that I've opened up the Q&A. So if you have questions that you'd like to raise for Professor Abrahamian, you can put them there. I believe you can also upvote questions. So if we get a ton, I'll just start with the ones that have the most votes. Um, Maybe as people are typing out their questions, I could just start. And my question is, why would Israel want to see Iran balkanized? It seems to me that this would create a much worse security situation.
Um, well, I think that here you could also see it among some of the intellectuals in Israel, is Israel would be much more secure if there are no basically major states in the region. And there has been talk of basically cities, Middle East formed of city-states, of course, with the exception of Israel. But you have various other city-states here and there. And small city-states, of course, will not pose a problem for Israel. And the disintegration of Iran, if that was happened, it would be no skin off Israeli backs. It will be, of course, Iran will suffer. The immediate neighbors suffer. Europe might suffer. But why should Israel worry about that? And similarly for the United States, if there's basically blowback, and the blowback will be for other countries, especially Europe. And we know Trump doesn't lose sleepless nights over Europe. Uh, and the disintegration of states seems sort of very drastic, radical, but that's what happened in other countries. There is now no Iraqi state. There is no really Iraqi Syria, no Iraqi Libya. And if you look back, actually, Brzezinski thought Russia, after the Soviet Union was too big, Russia should be also divided into three or four smaller states. So there's really radical thinking among some of the extremists in both the United States and Israel.
Okay, we have a question in the chat here. How long do you guess Trump can extend this fragile ceasefire since none of the meetings have reached a meaningful deal?
Well, I think the problem Trump has is, of course, in Wall Street, because I mean, the longer the crisis goes, the price of oil is gas, fertilizers is going to rise. I mean, it's over 100 now. It could. People are talking that eventually it could reach actually to 200. And then what's going to happen? The price of gas at the pumps. As the Iranian government actually noted, Americans will be soon nostalgic for the days when gasoline was $4 a gallon. It could go up to basically $8 or $9. So what Trump is trying to do is trying to assure the public that no, this is a short-term factor. Either Iran will submit, surrender, or collapse. And this is obviously not happening. So he really has dug himself into a real problem here. It's not so much military problem; it's a question of economic problem that's going to directly affect the Trump administration.
I think I saw a report today in the New York Times, or I can't remember where I saw it, but speculation that Trump might be prepared, or is in talks anyway, to essentially bribe Iran with billions of dollars to reopen the strait. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, his thinking is sort of businessman. Yeah, if you offer Iran maybe money, they will take it. And the notion is, that it's the bazaar mentality in Iran will be tempted by it. But the problem here is, I think, his ego, the Trump's ego, that somehow he's got himself into a war and he's buying himself out. I don't see him able to psychologically be able to do that. Uh, so again, it's his own making that has put himself in a bind. So if he steps down, I mean, if he compromises and he appears compromises, it's going to undermine his not only his support but his ego. I mean, the best deal he could have is really to go back to the Obama agreement, which was perfectly fine. Uh, Maybe he could basically package it somewhat different, instead of 3.67, 3.6% or something, and then hoodwink to the public that this was a brand new, much more drastic deal. But again, that's going to be very hard to do. So I don't. I feel sorry for people in Iran and American public, but I don't feel sorry for Trump's problem that he has created himself. And
Also, the Lego videos can't be helping either.
no, someone has a lot of sense of humor in Tehran, I must say.
Okay, the next question is why historically and currently doesn't Iran have powerful allies that could change the sense of vulnerability of the Iranian state to US-Israeli aggression? It seems to me that if Iran had allies, this war wouldn't have happened in the first place.
Well, the Iranian Revolution was a bit, one of its slogans was neither East nor West, i.e., neutralism. And this goes back to actually the Mossadegh period, 51, 53. They use Mossadegh, they use the different terminology, but he was also a strong neutralist. First of the third world countries that didn't want to be allied to either. But besides that, besides Iranian basically outlook, there's also the problem is that major powers are quite happy seeing what the situation is now. Why should Russia or China get involved? As long as US is bogged down in a quagmire and is in an embarrassing position, it's fine for them. I'm sure both Putin and Xi are opening up champagne bottles, watching basically U.S. being bogged down in these situations. Why should they get involved? So they might, in the National Security Council, give protection to Iran. They might even, uh, give some arms, but not of significant amount because Iran is self-sufficient in the type of weapons it uses. So there's no reason for other countries, major countries, to get involved. They enjoy the situation as it is. So
We
I
have
think,
another question who was asking specifically about China. Do you think China is just content to sit on the sidelines?
yeah, why not? I mean, they're sitting pretty after all in the sidelines. It's distracting United States. their long-term policy is, of course, unification with Taiwan. And as long as US is distracted, it basically helps them prepare for what they think is the final goal. Uh, and of course, as long as they get some oil, and of course, they're not that dependent on Iranian oil, but as long as they get some oil, that's fine for them. And of course, for Russia, the longer this continues, the price of oil goes up, and that brings in new money to the coffers of Russia. So it's not, I don't think it's Iran's failure to have allies. It's not a failure of their foreign policies. I think it's more the international situation. But what you find actually is in public opinion throughout the world, there's a lot of sneaking admiration for this small country that is able to challenge the United States. So countries that before were horrified of having a theocracy dominate are now somewhat actually admiring Iran for being able to challenge the United States.
Okay, next question. How do you think Trump's initial aims are different than they are now? How have they evolved over these several days?
Well, it's hard to find out what the aims are because, again, I said if you outsource your foreign policy to another country, you basically don't really have a foreign policy. So often in the press is that U.S. national policy should be this, and then imposing what should be to what is actually or Trump is trying to get. When you listen to Trump, there is no coherent policy. Some days he's talking about is the nuclear program. Some days there's proxies. Some days it's because the Iranians are just crazy. You can't deal with them. It's some days it's that there'll be reasonable people coming to power in Iran we can negotiate with. There'll be a regime change. So it's complete incoherence. And here, actually, I mean, it's surprising, actually, for a modern state, which United States presumably was, has reverted to use a Max Weberian language, to a sultanate, where the sultan makes decision on the spur of the moment, taking advice from family members or household slaves. And here, maybe a foreign prime minister, Netanyahu, but there is no, you can actually see, there is no National Security Council to formulate a policy towards Iran. And a good indication of that is when they brought a few months ago a national security plan for United States. There was actually just one phrase about Iran. There was nothing about Iran. So there is no, I would say, U.S. policy, a workshop or a committee or a council in the State Department that is formulated coherent or even an incoherent policy towards Iran. It's all basically on the spur of the moment what the Sultan thinks is the best for getting a deal. So in a way, actually, ironically, the Iranian state is more modern than the U.S. state because in Iran, sure, there is a supreme leader, but in fact, they have a large National Security Council that sits down and hammers out policy, and different interests go in. It's Revolutionary Guards, diplomats, economic interests, academics. They have an input, and final decision is the supreme leader, but there is some sort of attempt to hammer out a policy. I don't see that at present under the Trump administration, which is much more dangerous because when it's on the spur of the moment by one person, it can be very erratic, and you could easily venture into sort of things one doesn't usually to venture into, a nuclear use of resort to nuclear weapons.
Next question is one of the justifications, which we know was disingenuous, of course, for the assault on Iran was the liberation of the Iranian people. What impacts do you anticipate the war having on Iranian civil society, which has made gains in recent years despite state repression?
Well, I mean, I think the regime was actually very unpopular beginning of the year before this war. What the war has done naturally is given it a second wind boost because uh, even those who hate the regime are less likely to oppose the regime at wartime. Famous Goebbels statement, the Nazi regime was most popular when Allied bombs were dropping on German cities. So even if you didn't like the Nazi regime, you had no choice but to support the regime where you're being bombed. So I think the regime has actually uh, got some legitimacy which it lacked. But the legitimacy now is much more based on nationalism, national identity, especially when it dawns on people that there is an existential threat to Iran. It's not just a threat to the regime, but to Iran as a whole. I think people who hate the regime are likely to actually support, not necessarily support, but be very much more reluctant to openly oppose the regime. Uh, so even in the diaspora, when the war started, there was actually a, a poll taken in the U.S. Iranian diaspora. It was pretty evenly broken, 50-50%. That has drastically shifted actually now against the war. So even monarchists, some monarchists who supported the war at the beginning have second doubts about it and are much less likely to support a war against their own country, especially if it leads to atrocities like killing of hundreds of school children, um, bombing of the Pasteur Institute, which was almost a sacred institute in Tehran. Something that hasn't been mentioned often in American press, the sinking of a cadet ship that was not even armed, with hundreds of naval cadets drowning. These sort of atrocities have actually, I think, inhibited the opposition to the regime.
Can Israel exercise a veto if Trump decides to make a deal with Iran by what it chooses to do in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, on realistic terms, of course, uh, is Netanyahu has a lot of personal influence. But if Trump decides something as president of the United States, he has basically the upper hand. He can tell Israel what goes. And the famous phrase of, I can't remember, it was Clinton or Obama said, to about Netanyahu, who does he think is the big superpower here, Israel or United States? So once that type of ego is used on Trump, I think his chauvinism, American chauvinism, would trump his support for Israel.
Yeah, I believe it was Clinton who said that.
It was Clinton, is it?
Yeah.
I can imagine Obama saying it. But
Um, so I mean, I have a question, and that's related to Israel. One of my concerns is that they do have a kind of veto, and that is obviously nuclear weapons. And with the kind of leadership you see in Israel these days, you wonder if they would be prepared to drop a nuclear bomb.
I think they would if Iran did have a nuclear bomb or was close to it. I think that's basically a card they always hold, and I think the Iranians know that, and that's why the Iranian government has never really uh, moved towards nuclear weapons because they know they would. But in a normal situation, it would. I mean, Israel is already a pariah state throughout the world, including now in the American public. If it resorts to out of the blue to use it in this present situation, it would be actually there would be no question that Israel would be the new Nazis of the 21st century.
Do you think an international event like the World Cup will have any effect on stopping the current situation? Because, as you said, the price of gas has been rising more. Is it going to put more pressure on Trump?
I don't know how much sports actually influences that. Uh, I'm surprised even the World Cup is being in North America, but I'm surprised whether that many people are going to come. Maybe love of sports will up trump the dislike of United States, and maybe even Canadians will come across the border, but I'm not sure about that.
Um, okay, so the questions are slowing down a bit, so I'm gonna have to turn to my notes here. Um, I saw actually in the New York Times this morning there was a graph. I don't know if you saw it, and it was looking at the belligerence of American political statements, right? And it was doing a kind of correlation between the level of enrichment that's going on in Iran and the bellicosity of American political rhetoric. I wonder what you thought. What do you think about this?
But what is actually is staggering is if you follow even the mainstream media, like New York Times, uh, they talk as if there was no Obama agreement. And they talk as if Iran suddenly, out of the blue, increased its enrichment from 3.67 to all the way to 60%, from 200 grams to 400 grams, out of the blue, without taking it in the context that the enrichment, high enrichment, was done as a reaction to the U.S. withdrawing from the agreement. So in the polemics, I think just leaving that out, that incident or history out, basically gets people thinking that, well, Iran is out to build a bomb, and therefore Iran is dangerous. But if you actually put it in context, it's a very different, I think, has a different meaning. And I'm sure the Iranian negotiators, I don't have access to them, obviously, but if the Iranian negotiators were offered to reduce their amount of enriched back to the 3.67, they would be more than happy to do it since they already accepted the Obama agreement. But it's been the US that has been basically intransigent over that.
Hmm. We have a rather long comment here, so I'll see what we can pull out of it. Um, Turning back to Israel, what exactly is the state trying to achieve? It seems to become a pariah state with a genocide, of course. Um, but the questioner wonders, is it possible that we should look beyond Israeli strategic calculation alone? couldn't fundamentalist Christian Zionism or other external ideological and geopolitical forces be helping to drive its trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the American right, that is incidentally anti-Semitic, and is basically uh, obsessed with the Book of Revelations, which is an anti-Semitic work, is an ardent supporter of Israel for political reasons, for cynical political reasons. But I don't think that sector of the American wing is that really drives policy. Israel uses that, and the Republicans use that. But I think the more mainstream Republican tendency is to actually not to be driven by that. I think the Israeli policy, or at least the Netanyahu policy, is to uh, not face the Palestinian issue, which I was mentioning. And if you don't address that issue, then the way to distract the Israeli public is to talk about basically external threats. And a way of dealing with external threats is one, destroy any potential external threat, and also expand your territories as much as possible. So Israel is taking advantage of the present crisis, basically trying to push its borders all the way north to the Litani River, which has been always part of the Israeli policy, and also basically take over Gaza and also the West Bank. So increase basically its territory as much as possible. And the idea is that the more wider borders you have, territory, the more then the Jewish community will be secure. And I think this probably plays well among many Israelis. I'm not sure it plays very well among the Jewish diaspora outside.
Okay, so I'm going to read this next question, but I think I'm also going to allow everyone to unmute themselves if they wish going forward, just because we have a rather small group. And I had only I had only implemented the security to begin with because we received some monarchist hate mail over this event, so I wanted to kind of control what was going on. But we are small, so I've given everybody the ability to unmute themselves. I'll just read the next question, and then if people want to just pose themselves out loud, that's fine. So, some of my students who read excerpts of your work this spring were struck by how your analysis was so prophetic about what's happening right now. I know historians are not in the business of predicting the future, but what do you imagine is going to be the end game with this war?
Uh, I didn't know I made any predictions. I'm glad some of them were right, but I would hate to go back and look at them. Um, it's hard, I mean, to me, well, it's not a prediction, but it's more what could happen. Is that if it continues, as I alluded to, I think it can lead to actually a major depression in the West, economic depression, because this is at a time when already there are a lot of problems in the American economy. The basically uh, the systems that were set up to monitor banks were loosened after the last recession. We have now unprecedented national debt, something like $40 trillion. We don't know really what's happening with all the high tech going into artificial intelligence. This is a sort of black hole. We're due to a recession. If a recession comes, I think it's likely to come, it could turn into a depression because The usual Keynesian systems of dealing with the recession are not there available at the moment. If we go back to Keynes, the argument Keynes always made is that if you have good times, you basically save reserves to handle bad times. But what we've done under Trump is actually, in the good years, given all the extra money to the extra wealthy. And the national debt has actually escalated. So if a recession comes, it would be near impossible to have a Keynesian ways of trying to limit the recession. And you could get back a situation back to 1929 where it'll snowball into a major depression. And I'm not sure if the folks in Tehran are savvy enough with Keynesian economics to know that. But if they're aware of that, they have a much higher trump card than people realize. I mean, the U.S. Can bomb the hell out of Iran, but Iran can also bomb the hell out of crucial, very fragile states in the Gulf. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. All these countries are very fragile based on oil, gas, fertilizers, uh, 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 turning seawater into drinking water. These facilities, at the drop of a hat, can be destroyed. And that would mean a destruction of basically the whole economy of the Gulf, which would directly affect the United States. So since those economies are so tied to uh, United States economics, not just the Trump family economics, but to uh, high tech, to artificial intelligence, to Musk, a collapse of the Gulf could have direct implications for the whole capitalist system throughout the world. Uh, so that's something that people don't talk about, but it's not I'm not predicting it, but I'm saying this is a real issue that should be taken into account. And I don't think that people around Trump are savvy enough to sit down and think it out, because they thought basically 3 days of bombing was going to solve the problem.
I wonder, and anyone feel free to jump in as you like. But I wanted to ask what your sense is of the decision-making apparatus these days in Iran, because as I understand, the new Ayatollah is injured and sort of not part of the decision-making process. What's your sense of how decisions are being made, just basic wartime decisions?
Well, I'm sure it's very much like before. It's a collective decision making, and there is a National Security Council. Uh, in there, the Revolutionary Guards probably have more say now than before. The final say is, as before, with the supreme leader. So even if he's incapacitated, he's probably able to mentally function and make a decision. Uh, so there is a decision-making system. And any agreement they come to is probably sort of ironed out in a collective system. So the idea somehow it's going to be factionalized and it's chaotic. Uh, we're probably superimposing what we see in Washington on that system. Uh, but otherwise, the people who have emerged, Ghalibaf, for instance, has I think quite a lot of support within the Revolutionary Guards, and he still I think has some diplomats and negotiators who before actually worked with the Obama administration. So it's the idea is somehow that there is chaos there. I wouldn't buy that argument. So far, they've been able to make decisions, and it's usually the other side that's failed to actually show up or do anything. And the main problem I think they have is I can imagine in their discussions, the main problem they would have, especially argument that the more hardliners would use, whether from Revolutionary Guards or elsewhere, would be, any agreement you make with Trump is not worth the paper it's written on. You know, you can make an agreement, then next week he could say, they were disrespectful. I'm going to tear it apart. I mean, I'm sure people in Tehran read New York Times. They know how Trump deals with old-time allies, whether Britain or Denmark, or how he deals with universities in America or even law firms. So for him, agreements are something made to be broken when necessary. Uh, so that would be the main obstacle, I think, for them to come to a solid agreement. Is how are you going to guarantee the other side? Maybe they could say, well, yes, we'll agree, but you first have to give us the money. When we have the money, then we'll fulfill our agreement. But otherwise, just an agreement. Trump is basically actually flaunts the fact that he doesn't abide with agreements. Normally, you could say, well, two states have agreement, they can go to an international body, the UN, have it endorsed. But again, Trump has made it clear that he doesn't abide by international agreements. So that, again, is a problem he's made himself.
Okay, we have a
Do you
question.
think that you being such a notable historian of the world, not just Iran in many ways, do you think that nevertheless we are in unprecedented territory internationally in terms of one struggles in terms of past empires and even past world conflicts to see this kind of impact that a leader has on the entire world in this kind of arbitrary way, with so many so affected and yet also so powerless to have an impact on the outcome. I'm thinking, for obviously the UN is powerless, but then you have even these, great substantial economic powers in Europe have no particular power. You mentioned, very interestingly, the fragility, and I totally agree with that, the fragility of the Gulf states. And I mean, that's true also. I don't think you could, some of those states are populated mainly by foreign workers who will melt away in many ways. So it's as if the entire, not just the world economy, but the entire geopolitics is kind of sitting on the pin of this needle being Trump almost. And I just find that somewhat unprecedented in world history. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is unprecedented. I mean, in the past, when you've had major blocs, there have been balancing. There was Soviet Union, United States. Until China really rises, maybe in 10 years' time, there'll be basically a balancing power. But in this present time, what you have is unique in two terms. One is that U.S. is no doubt the main military power in the world, the dominant power, military power. Two, You have an unprecedented situation where you have one man, a sultan, I keep on saying, basically in charge. Basically, the Republican Party has abdicated. There is no congressional opposition. It's all basically run by one person who doesn't really, is not interested, does not listen, is ignorant actually, uh, to use actually his own former State Department secretary. I don't know if I can use the term, but F moron. I mean, this was a term his own Secretary of State used for him. That's an unprecedented, and it's very dangerous. And it reminds me of something that one of the Quinces once said. The most underestimated force in human history is stupidity. Okay. I mean, he meant basically, I think, stupidity in high positions because you and I can be stupid, but we don't have an input into state policy. But when you have stupidity at the top, that's really serious, especially it's all one person without any restraints on him. And he clearly he flaunts the fact that there are no restraints on him. I mean, the fact that he says I can shoot someone in Fifth Avenue and that I can get away with it. He says the only thing that stops me is my morality. And you know what his morality is? It's basically of rats in a sewer. So you have basically faced an unprecedented, dangerous situation.
I wanted to just raise a question from the chat, but others feel free to chime in afterwards. What do you think of the impact of the United Arab Emirates exit from OPEC?
Uh, yes, I don't know if it have much effect because United Arab Emirates is fairly small in terms of oil production, and already actually OPEC no longer functioned the way it was in the 70s. So much oil was being produced elsewhere. I don't think it was never actually, OPEC was never really a so-called cartel that people sort of argued that they could fix prices. It was much more due to supply and demand. And I don't think in long term its leaving is going to have much effect on oil prices. And I also actually, I think they're leaving uh, OPEC is a way of showing their resentment at the Saudis because they have an ongoing problem with the Saudis over the Sudan and also Yemen, and they don't want to be basically a second fiddle to uh, the Saudi prince.
If I
And so much of oil now actually sold under the table, the price. A few countries, I think, really abide by the price set by OPEC. Well, I think, I mean, the regime, which started with a great deal of popularity, I would say legitimacy because of the revolution, uh, very systematically made itself unpopular by basically cutting off this and that group. They cut off reformers, Islamic reformers such as Bozargan, the first prime minister, his movement. They cut off the Mujahideen, the radical Muslims. They cut off nationalists, supporters of the Mossadegh movement. They cut off the left, various leftist groups. So there was a systematic, basically making the system as narrow as possible, but from their point of view, as solid as possible. But that reduced its core support. But then added to that, of course, was the economic sanctions, which devastated the middle class, increased poverty. I think many people in Iran unfairly blamed the regime for the sanctions. The argument was if you were more flexible, more forthcoming, you would actually not have these sanctions, which I think they were misjudging the policies of Israel and the United States. So they put the onus on the regime for the economic hardships, while the onus should have really been on external powers. But that also, I think, added to the unpopularity. And then I think there's added reason, but I don't think it's that important. A question of corruption became a major issue. Now, there is corruption in Iran, but then, which country doesn't have corruption? Whether it was more than elsewhere, I'm not sure. I mean, the supreme leader was not selling in his bunker bitcoins. It was not that type of corruption. But clearly, what you have is when you have a regime under economic pressure, the institutions that control trade are in a good position to actually siphon off money. But how much of it actually was siphoned off by people close to the regime or people, third parties, basically, let's say United Arab Emirates or Qatar, there was a lot of corruption there because third parties doing go-between trade actually were taking advantage of that situation. But people are very much focused on the corruption as if that was a major issue. Another issue actually that came up often is the water shortage, blaming the regime for inefficiency and basically the crisis in irrigation and water. Again, the regime partly to blame because of some bad policies, but on the whole, the water shortage was caused by global warming. Again, you could actually see the links between diaspora groups who blame the regime for shortage of water. They give all the reasons why the government is responsible for it. But they never mention global warming because their patron in Washington doesn't believe in global warming. So by leaving that out, it's a good giveaway of who politically they're allied with. But it's interesting that the issue of corruption is, I think, very sensitive, although not necessarily legitimate. If you compare the Iranian situation with Cuba, both regimes were under great economic pressure. In Iran, corruption became a vocal issue among the protests. In Cuba, however bad the economy is, it's not a real issue because I think there's a much less ostentatious living among the Cuban elite compared to the wealthy in Iran. So the regime in Iran, despite all the radical talk, is very much a petty bourgeois regime. And the people in the links with Bazaar have actually done quite well economically. And this can be quite apparent. You can see it basically in people's lives, how they dress, how they live, where they live, gated communities, and so on. and that becomes a weakness for the regime. Uh, so that there's a contrast, actually, but interesting contrast between Cuba, a socialist state, and Iran, still very much a capitalist state.
We have a question in the chat. Iran, like many other authoritarian regimes, is using the war to suppress opposition inside the country. Over the last few weeks, they've executed a number of individuals. Do you think this will continue under the circumstances, or will there be certain changes internally as a result of the war and its aftermath? And also, 2 million people have lost their jobs. Wouldn't this cause tremendous upheaval and riots in the coming months?
Yeah, I think in the maybe long term or short term, but not necessarily in the immediate term. I think in the immediate term, as I was stressing, I think there'll be less open opposition. But in long terms, uh, the regime, even if it resorts to using more nationalistic language, it will still, because it sees itself as an existential threat, seen as facing an existential threat, it will actually continue using hard sledgehammers against opposition. Uh, I mean, the smart thing for it is to open up. But I think the mentality of the Revolutionary Guard, especially in wartime, is to become more intransigent. So even though they open up ideologically, become more nationalistic, less Islamic, that doesn't necessarily mean a more liberal. You can have plenty of nationalistic, chauvinistic regimes that are not respectful of individual rights or liberties.
Maybe we have time for just one more question.
Yes, I think I see not 2009 as a landmark period because Mousavi, I mean, he was part of the original government. He was the prime minister. He actually was very efficient in having a war economy during the Iraqi war. He had that reputation. He was willing to work with actually with professional technocrats, people who knew actually something about politics. If he had been permitted to take over office, I think it would have been much more opening to others, including, of course, nationalists, not necessarily but not necessarily people from the theocracy, but to, I would say, Islamic reformers, Islamic even radicals. But Ahmadinejad brought in this whole basically, first of I would say, right-wing populism of that he was going to basically be a man of the people. And one way of doing this was to claim that there was no Holocaust. This actually basically further isolated Iran internationally, and internally it basically turned off much of the educated middle class. Uh, this, I think, yeah, the I think the trajectory would have been very different if Ahmadinejad had not been elected. Um, and we don't know. I mean, actually, in the first round, we're not sure if Ahmadinejad actually lost. What really happened, probably he did not get the majority that was needed. So there was going to be a second round. And in the second round, Mousavi would have won because there was a last minute upsurge of swing towards Mousavi. So it was a very sort of fluid electorate. And in the last week of the election, the swing went to Mousavi. And if that had continued, he would have, in the second round, certainly would have won. So in a way, it was a contested election. But I think if it was permitted to actually have run its proper course, Mousavi would have definitely become prime minister. And then I think Iran's prospects would have been very different.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank Professor Abrahamian very much for so generously giving his time to us tonight. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of the Brook Farm community and making this event a great success. Stay tuned for future events. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.